Get started. So welcome, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. This is the workshop in cultural affairs with the Center for Cultural Affairs. We're excited to have you. And we're very excited to have our speaker for today, Professor Wen Guo from Elon University. And I first got to meet Wen at the workshop last summer for the AEI lab. So I'm glad to have you back, Wen. It's really a pleasure to hear about your work and get to know you a little bit more. So with that, I hand it over to Wen, and she'll go through a presentation, and I will help moderate the questions. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We generally try to reserve questions for after the presentation. So put them in the chat, and then after the presentation, we'll open up the floor and you can just enable your audio. All right, with that, I will hand it over to you, Wen.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and everyone who's attending this session. Joanna did a good job of introducing me. So just adding to that, my research interests are generally cultural policy and cultural economy from the perspective of network governance, entrepreneurship, and community engagement. So today, I'm so glad that I will be able to share one of my recent publications on network governance. Sorry, I'm trying to, it doesn't go to the next slide.
Let's see.
Okay, here we go, sorry. Yeah, so the title of the paper is Institutional Entrepreneurship Through Network Governance. It's a descriptive social network analysis of National Endowment Arts Creative Placemaking National Initiative. So in arts administration, partnership and relationships is very critical at both personal, organizational, and policy level. Understanding the complex system of arts world through the structural perspective will enhance strategic thinking of both practitioners and policymakers. So here's a little bit roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. So first, I will talk about my motivation of conducting the research, giving a little bit more background from the practical perspective, and then I will share about how did I arrive at the research questions, and then how did I conduct the research by collecting data and the analytical methodology, and finally, I would talk about the findings and implications of this study. So I will first start by talking about what is creative placemaking. For anyone who's interested in cultural policy, must have known about this policy pretty well. So by using the definition from the white paper of National Endowment for the Arts, it is defined as partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social characters of a neighborhood, town, city, or regional ground around arts and cultural activities. This policy was pretty much led and carried out through the Our Town program of National Endowment for the Arts and its offshoot organization, Art Place America. So it is a combination of practices that deeply engage arts into the social and cultural fabric of local communities. A little bit about the history of NEA, because we're talking about the governance strategy of NEA. The review of the historic city would really help us understand the critical role this creative place making policy plays in the history of National Endowment for the Arts. So NEA was founded in 1963 after National Endowment for the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act was signed into the law by President Lyndon Johnson. However, the very survival of the agency was challenged since Cultural War due to the sharp public controversies over its funding policy. After Republicans took over the House, its funding was reduced to the level that most of its programs were halted, and the agency was only able to manage its operation. And the NEA's funding level was only able to return to its 1995 level since President Obama took over the House. Took over the office. And in 2010, NEA funding returns to the 1995 level. So NEA at the 2010 faced a very critical issue. How should we rise from the ashes of the Cultural War by having our funding back to our normal level? tracking back the history of the NEA, improving built environment and artist housing, funding public art, and integrating arts into communities have always been part of the NEA's policy agenda. So for instance, one of the earliest program of National Endowment for the Arts was actually to start out this artistic housing projects in New York, which is the West Best Artist Village. A lot of us probably have already known, and this program is still going on right now. A lot of the offsprings of artists who used to occupy those housing can still have the right to live there. And another one is the architecture planning and design program. So if you look at the yearbook of National Endowment for the Arts, you can see different iterations and different names of the program. But the nature of the programs is very similar. It's really about enhance the built infrastructure through the arts. But due to the focus of the different years during the past few decades, the focus of the program have been shifted for several times. So in 1986, the Mayor's Institute for City Design was founded as a partnership between U.S. Conference of Mayors, American Institute of Architecture, and the NEA. While the state and local arts councils were founded since 1970s, the relationship between the NEA and the municipal governments were pretty much enhanced through this collaboration. All right, by talking about that historicity, it seems like using community development as a tool to come back to the major political stage for NEA seems to be a good option. So there's a need for a new institutional arrangement for American cultural policy led by National Endowment for the Arts. When we're talking about institutional arrangement in the context of arts, we're primarily focusing on the three questions. First, how is the arts perceived by the public? Second, how is the arts advocated for? And how is the arts funded? And so this new institutional arrangement requires the NEA to rebalance and readjust the triple bottom line standard of accountability and organizational effectiveness for all professional nonprofit arts organizations in the States. The triple bottom line is comprised of a competing sets of elements, including perceived public benefit of the arts, artistic quality, and financial necessity of arts organizations. These three competing elements characterize the evolving public expectation for nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. So the need for new institutional arrangement requires the NEA to leverage resources to create new institutions or transform existing ones. So instead of transforming the existing arts policy institution, which refers to the existing arts funding programs and infrastructure built through the regional, state, and local arts councils, NEA decided to create a new policy concept called creative placemaking as this new policy institution. So this study wants to understand this governance strategies of NEA as an institutional entrepreneur from a structural perspective when he's setting up this new institution called creative placemaking. So the network perspective is going to be used based on the following assumptions. So fundamentally, American policy process is a malleable, multi-level and cross-sector relationships. So here is how I kind of visualize this assumption based on a kind of a general network graph. So you have a policy program or policy problem there, or a set of resources over here. And policy actors across businesses, civil society, and government sectors are interested in either in this policy problem or the set of resources. So they forge a network by building relationships across levels and sectors in this process of resources change or setting rules of game around the problem or the resource. So based on that assumption, I formulated 3 questions to understand the governance strategies of NEA through creative placemaking. The first one is, who's involved in the horizontal collaborative governance network the NEA built at the national level through CPM policy. So this project pretty much focused on the horizontal collaborative governance level at the national level. There are a lot of network at the local level and state level, but that's outside of the scope of the research. And second, what are the strategies used by the NEA to build and coordinate this national level governance network? And finally, what are the underlying arts policy goals of the NEA as an institutional entrepreneur in building this governance network? So now I wanted to share my methodology to study these questions. Because in nature, this study is more of a qualitative study based on social network analysis. So there were two methods were used. One is social network analysis. Second is archival document analysis. So the way that I chose to capture the national CPM policy networks is through hyperlinks in websites owned by CPM policy actors. So policy actors tie to each other through the hyperlinks in their web page, referring to each other's web pages. This is a pretty important assumption of how I collect the data. There is evidence showing that hyperlinks can mirror the real world policy network. So for instance, this is a screenshot of the website of the Center for Cultural Affairs. And you were promoting the Association for Cultural Economics International, which is another conference. So you're basically sending you're basically referring the other organization by having their hyperlinks listed on your website. So the Center for Cultural Affairs is the sender of the relationship, and the conference is a receiver of the relationship. So a network relation is established in this way. Hyperlinks can represent trust and endorsement as an important resource of power because policy actors exercise their power through selecting partners. And hyperlinks can also reflect a common interest of policy actors and formulate issue-based network, which is the case of CPM. The specific process of me capturing the network is summarized in these steps. So first, I used the officially claimed national CPM partners at seed web links. So for instance, they are National Endowment for the Arts, Art Place America, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Kresge Foundation, and a few others. And I use an online crawling software to generate web links, to generate hyperlinks of these organizations and other organizations involved. So the algorithm is programmed to retain pages receiving at least one hyperlink from these seed organizations. So it's basically from statistical perspective, snowball sampling aspects. So when I was doing the research, it was 2018. So the data is trained up to 2018. So if you're running the hyperlinks right now, it's going to look very different from when I was attending the network. Then I wanted to talk about the key social network measure that I'm going to use for this network. So the first important measure is called in-degree centrality. It is measured by the number of ties received by policy network. So in this generic network we're seeing on the screen, you can see that Emma is very popular. She's receiving a lot of links and relationships from other people. So typically it measures popularity. In the policy process context, typically the popularity represents the authority of a policy actors. So basically, a policy actors will have a lot of saying authority to be referred by other policy actors through hyperlinks. And a second measure is out-degree centrality. It is calculated by the number of ties sent by a policy actors to other people. So for instance, in this generic network, you can see Jill is sending a lot of network to a relationship to other people. She seems to be a very big social butterfly in this network that who is very active. So typically this measures policy actors' initiation of activities, how active these policy actors are in trying to connecting people. The third measure is between centrality. It is calculated as the number of paths a policy actor lies between two unconnected policy actors. So in this graph, you'll be able to see Liz seems to be a very crucial person in this network. If we're taking Liz out of this network, this graph can be cut into two pieces. So we can say Liz is the person that has a lot of connectivity. She has a lot of leveraging and brokerage power. So between centrality is used to measure connectivity, indicating leveraging and brokerage power of a policy actor. And if we're taking Liz out of the network, the place Liz fails to fill is typically called a structural hole in this network. Finally, the measure work I'm going to talk about is eigenvector centrality. It is not as intuitive as the other ones. So it is kind of calculated by the smallest farness of an actor to others by taking the global structure of a network into account. So let's take two actors who has a same number of direct connections as an example over here. So both Leah and Liz have 3 direct connections with others in this graph. However, Leah may have higher eigenvector centrality score because her friends all have more connections than Liz's friends. So this gives Leah a broader scope of influence than Liz. So basically, eigenvector centrality measures the reachability of a policy actor. It measures the scope of influence of policy actors. So as you can see, that's the 3 connections both actors are having in this network. But apparently, if you're looking at Leah, Jill is one of her friends, but Jill occupies a much central position in this network because Jill has a lot of more connections than Liz, who only has Ellen as her friend and Emma and Shane. All right, based on the methods and analytical process I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the key findings of this study. First, the research question, who are the policy actors in this network? So in addition to Art Place America, National Endowment for the Arts, and the Christie Foundation, the crawling software generated 69 policy actors in the National CPM Policy Network. So I categorized them by the generic function of these organizations. They're government organizations, advocacy and professional service organizations, consulting and research organizations, foundation, and banks. So I'm going to give you several examples for each type of the organization. So for instance, in government, definitely we're having NEA, HUD, Department of Transportation, the White House, Department of Human Service, Department of Education, and a few others. And for advocacy professional service organizations and consulting research organizations, I divided them into 2 main categories. One is those organizations in the arts, another one is organizations in the community development sector. The color that you saw on this table are the colors that I'll be using in my social network graph. So we'll be able to identify them easily later. So now I would like to take a look at the summary statistics of the whole network. So this is the box plots for the in-degree centrality of all the organizations, but categorized by their different service types. So we can see on average, government agencies have high in-degree scores in general. They're definitely the authority of the network, and they're represented primarily by National Endowment for the Arts, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Some of other organizations in other sectors like Art Place America, Kresge Foundation, Springboards for the Arts, Americans for the Arts, they're also sort of authorities in this network too. The second graph is the between centrality score in box plot. And we can see that different sectors are pretty similar. Their scores are very similar, average scores are pretty similar. But the by number, federal agencies are a little bit higher. We're not showing the numbers here, but if we're great number in general, government agencies are having higher score in terms between us. And NEA, HUD, Art Place America are also key brokers in general as well. And we can see NEA has the highest between a score in this graph, and it kind of confirms the assumption of the study. The federal NEA is definitely the institutional entrepreneur that try to coordinate all the different resources coming from different sectors. And the third graph is the eigenvector score. So what we're seeing here is research consulting organizations are the influencers in the network. And they have a lot of eigenvector scores. So based on what we saw in the in the statistical summary, we have the three major findings. The NEA, HUD, Kresge Foundation, and Art Place America are both the leaders and brokers in the general. And as institutional entrepreneur, the NEA brings together diverse stakeholders as allies and orchestrate their collective actions. And except for Kresge Foundation, the foundations and banks as financial supporters are not very active. So overall, look at the three box plazas, the Kresge found that most of the foundations and banks don't seem to communicate a lot through hyperlinks. So with some of the basic data about who are on the networks, and now I wanted to talk about what are the governance strategies performed by the NEA. So what we're going to do is to interpret the network by group of different groups of the arts organizations, just to zoom into the subgraphs of each group of the organizations. But because we're trying to understand the actions of NEA, we always keep NEA and its offshoot organization Art Place America in all of the subgraphs. So this is the NEA's Federal Interagency Coordination Network. We are only showing the in-degree network over here. If you're interested in seeing the out-degree, it's on my paper. So we can see in this network, NEA and Art Place America are referring to other federal agencies a lot, but they're not referred much by other agencies. So the circle, the size of the circle represents how much reference these, how much in-degree centralities these organizations are. So you can see HUD, USDA, White House, DOT, they are all bigger dots, which means they're referred by a lot of other federal agencies, but NEA and Art Place America are very small there. And if you zoom into the links, NEA and Art Place America almost are not like mentioned by other policy actors a lot. So based on that analysis, we come up with these findings. CPM is a kind of reactivation and a reinforcement of existing federal partner agencies of existing federal partnerships of national endowment for the arts. And federal partnership and endorsement is more of a top-down legitimacy process for creative placemaking. And NEA try to attain tangible resources and political support from all these other federal agencies. And it does a lot of venue shopping that increase capacity of agenda setting power of national endowment for the arts. After so many years that arts policy has always been a very marginalized policy issue at the federal level. So this summary doesn't only come from the network analysis, but also coupled with archival data analysis. So what I did is to take a look at all the partnership programs between NEA and other federal agencies to see how they work together. What are the goals of these programs? What are the tangible activities carried out by NEA and these partners? So this is the first part of the table. And in the next slide is the second part of the table. So I don't want to spend a lot of time to going through all these goals and activities they're doing, but based on this data, I generated the findings about venue shopping and attain tangible resources and political support from other federal agencies. All right, so next group we're going to go through is the out-degree-based subgraph of advocacy and professional service organization. The blue circles are those in the arts, the pink circles are those in the development field, and the yellow one is the political. You wouldn't be able to see the yellow one because it's very small. There's only one, which is U.S. Conference of Mayors at the bottom of the graph, and it's not very active in the graph. So based on the analysis of the graph, we can see arts advocacy and professional service organizations are more active than those in development and political fields. They're constantly sending links and relationships to other policy actors in the graph. And if you were looking at the in-degree-based subgraph of the advocacy professional service organizations, we can see that arts advocacy and professional service organizations are more popular than those in development and political fields. So in general, the policy actors in the arts are both more active and kind of more popular than those in development field and political field. So based on that network structure, we conclude that arts advocacy and professional service organizations, their existing arts policy governance structure of national endowment for the arts. What NEA was doing here is to use them, promote strategic moves, policy decisions, best practices program and grant information about CPM. And they try to re-embed CPM into the existing cultural governance infrastructure. Also, they try to use this organization to reorient efforts in arts production, audience research, and financial development in specialized arts disciplines. So, because a lot of those advocacy professional service organizations are the leading professional organizations for each arts disciplines. Another important thing that I want to see in this network is that if we're taking out some of the major brokers in this arts organization, we can see this network also is kind of broken into two parts. A lot of those organizations in the development sectors are not necessarily connected to the rest of the network. So basically, National Endowment for the Arts are using some key brokers to keep these two sectors connected. These organizations are CURD, MICD, and APA. So CURD is Citizens Institution of Rural Design. MICD is a Mayor's Institution of City Design. APA is the Association of American Planning Association. So these are the three key brokers that keeps two sectors connected. So based on that analysis, we can tell that the NEA is actually using these key brokers to bridge and influence the community development sector through new brokers, and they try to develop new constituencies for the arts in community development sector. The next group that we wanted to see is the consulting and research organization group. And we can see in this one is almost the opposite side of the advocacy one. So in this group of policy actors, the policy actors in the community development sector is much more popular and active in general. This is an out-degree graph, but in in-degree graph, we can also see they're referred a lot more by other policy actors than those in the arts sector. So based on the analysis, we conclude these findings. So the NEA tries to use the consulting and research organizations to develop discursive strategy and advance policy implementation. In terms of discursive strategy, we have to notice that CPM was not so much a new idea. It was only a choice of the NEA to create these new policy institutions to benefit both arts and community development. From a development perspective, they wanted to use arts to develop more participatory and cultural approach to community development. But from the arts perspective, they wanted to promote themselves as a viable service and solution to various complex community issues. And the second part of this is these consulting and research organizations in community development sectors have known the community development field very well. They have the knowledge and technical support to help arts better integrated in the development process. The final group that we're looking into is the foundations and banks subgraph of the CPM National Policy Network. So in this graph, what we can see is the Federal Reserve Banks of San Francisco and Kresge Foundations are very active. As an offshoot of NEA, Art Place America is a gateway to foundations. So without the connection formulated through Art Place America, it is really hard for NEA to be connected with the other organizations. And also, as impact investors, foundations are more active than banks because they're more actively, progressively involved in social issues in comparison to banks. They typically try to be more politically neutral, and their communication channels are typically not published on their website. But banks are definitely referred a lot for their resources and expertise by other policy actors. So based on the analysis of those subgraphs, these are some of the findings. I have talked about some of them and this kind of summary, what I've been kind of mentioning. So based on what we saw through the network analysis and the archival data from the policy documents and websites, we can conclude some of the underlying policy goals the NEA tries to kind of perform through governing these policy actors through creative placemaking. So I wanted to remind you that all we have been talking about is under the assumption that NEA lost its power of addressing macro level cultural policy since Cultural War. So we can see this graph talking about how this reduced the financial resources, decreased the political support, and diminished capacity to set a few norms for NEA. Even the NEA's budget went back to 1995 level after 2010. If you adjust for inflations and other factors, the budget size actually kind of decreased in terms of its portion in the overall federal budget. So under that kind of background, we can say by organizing, coordinating this governance network, the NEA really wanted to reclaim its legitimacy and stability of the NEA and arts policy. And second, they really wanted to reactivate local arts policy coalition and expand their constituencies. The third is to diversify and broaden relevance of the arts to the impact investment. And the fourth, they wanted to transfer the power of defining artistic quality to local communities. So I was able to connect these four goals to thinking about the standard we talked about related to the triple bottom line. So originally we thought public value, financial necessity, and artistic quality are three competing bottom lines for a cultural policy for NEA to adjust. But by using arts community, by connecting arts and community development through creative placemaking, we can see there is a tendency that the NEA tries to make the three bottom lines to actually reinforce each other. So when the local community is given more power to define arts quality, it is a lot easier for the public to recognize the value of the arts. And the more recognized the public value will motivate foundations and banks to be more interested in conducting that impact investment in communities, and which can enhance financial sustainability of arts organizations. So it seems like the logic model for creative placemaking has already transformed of a competing three bottom lines to a more mutually reinforced one. So this is kind of how I elevated this social network analysis to thinking about the overarching governance strategies of National Endowment for the Arts. And I think in general, this study has some of important implications for practitioners and policymakers and researchers to consider use the method and theory of social network analysis to understand the arts ecosystem at any level. This will give arts organization and artists insight about where they are in this ecosystem, how they can leverage relationship in the network to obtain tangible and intangible resources. And at the policy level, how policymakers were able to find their allies to reinforce their strategies and really kind of bring the arts policy to the table and kind of reinforce the role of cultural and arts policy in the overall kind of policy field instead of just a very kind of marginalized policy issue in comparison to a lot of other policy issues. Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I want to share about this research project. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Wen. We really appreciate it. There was some chat going on in the chat box, so I might start. So first off, I will say I really appreciate looking at cultural policy through this lens of social network analysis, just because I do think it's an appropriate tool to look at an informal policy sector. So I appreciated just the methods that you took and how you explained those. So thank you so much. So I'm going to start from the last question, because I think it relates to the implications that you discussed at the end of the presentation, and then go backwards, where some people on the chat were talking more about methods. But Sunil had a great question, and it was, can you offer any recommendations based on this analysis about the desirability and or efficiency of the NEA and other arts funders of cultural placemaking, making more direct connections with the community development field rather than relying largely on brokers, as your findings would suggest?
I think I think there was the issue over here is that in the history, making those direct connections probably brought some troubles to the NEA as a federal agency, and those direct connections probably put NEA in a position that there are some political bias by working with those big foundations directly. So instead of working with those foundations directly, it's kind of a more legitimate and political option for NEA to establish brokers to kind of, NEA is already an arm's length agency because of we need to abide by the speech of freedom, but NEA also have to be mindful about that too, by establish other arm's length agencies for itself to work with foundations. So I think it's more of a political choice.
Right. So some of the chat that was going on earlier too was just about, so King Fang had a great question, and then I think this related to both Mel Gray's question and also my question, which is more about like the context of the links, of the hyperlinks, and how you build those into a social network analysis. So I'll start with King Fang's second question and then move to our first one. So what does hyperlink mean in theories and practices? For instance, differences between information sharing, resources sharing, and budget sharing, they have significantly different implications. So like each of these links means something different. And how do you build that out perhaps in your project or in general in social network analysis?
So I think I should emphasize, I think I built this project pretty much as a kind of new way of NEA framing arts policy. It's more of agenda setting process. And there are some of tangible resource attainment based on how I analyzed some of the websites that I can get information, but a lot of them was really to publishing about their partnership. And that's really about choice of partners. And the choice of partners only tells us how NEA wants to frame this problem. It's not necessarily like I put so much efforts to understand the resource sharing, and resource sharing a lot of times was not published through hyperlink in a very detailed format. So I think agenda setting is the very perspective, and issue framing is the very perspective I wanted to approach through this.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder too, in relation to that question, do you also look at whether the receivers are also senders, like whether or not there's this back and forth relationship?
There are some of those, as I kind of mentioned earlier. So NEA, Art Place America, and those brokers are typically big senders and receivers too, because they're kind of the hub of the resource, like information for both sides. And I think probably in real life, those brokers are the major interface for the community development sectors to get connected with the arts sector, because they don't really know much how like the particular ecosystem, the arts. So we need this kind of some new brokers, new organizations to translate what's going on in the arts to the community development sector.
So if you find that if you find that a receiver is also a sender, does that get built in quantitatively to the strength of the relationship between the two different organizations?
That's a really good idea. I should have thought about, but it was not currently in my paper, but it's a really great idea to make it more kind of explicit in the paper. Yeah.
And then King Fang had another question, which is a great one too, which is, since this is a snowball sampling strategy, how did you actually choose the base cultural creative placemaking actors? Okay,
yeah, those seeds are published in one of the initial document, like website the NEA when they were announcing the creative placemaking policy. So those are the foundations of this. But I want to make sure that the policy actors of different sectors are included. So I intentionally choose seed actors to include government agencies, consulting and advocacy organizations, both in community development and arts. So making sure that I can reach like policy actors in all the fields that this policy tries to reach.
Okay, interesting. And I couldn't tell, but Mel had a question that I couldn't quite tell. Did you separate private financial organizations from Federal Reserve banks, or did you lump them all together as all banks?
Federal Reserve is the only government financial agency, so I just lumped them together. So
okay,
yeah.
So he mentioned maybe they could be separated given that they have such different right, functions.
That's true.
And then I had one question as well, which was it was, I guess I looked at the, well, actually, I'm going to skip my question because I think I'm going to see if there are no more questions. So let me go back to my question. If anybody else has a question, just go ahead, raise your hand, put it into the chat. So I said, I wonder whether the type of organization involved and the degree of their involvement has something to do with the legitimacy of the policy itself, and then policies in general, but obviously we're talking about this policy. But whether or not like that could be a next stage of this project to look at whether or not there are these different actors and kind of if there's staying power. Cultural policy is such a weird sector, right? Or policy sector, because it's not necessarily, government written policies. These are major programs that are initiated and implemented that ultimately become policy, but again, very much informal. So I'm wondering, like, is there some degree of involvement by different types of organizations that allow a different institutional policies to become more or less, policies?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea for kind of thinking about the strength of a relationship and how long it lasts. Yeah, but I was just thinking it's a really great idea, but I'm thinking about what it would be the best way to track those relationships. Tracking the evolution of a network is always a very challenging work to do from a kind of operationalization perspective. But I'm really happy to talk about, like, with your other people who's interested in doing this kind of thing, just thinking about how we track those relationships better.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think about I think it was Dave O'Brien and some of his colleagues released a paper on doing a social network analysis of board governance among London-based arts organizations. And depending on sort of how those organizations were connected and how many times those organizations popped up, obviously in the network analysis, this said a lot about who was in control, right? So like the control question is coming up, I'm starting to wonder, like, who's calling the shots here based on their degree of involvement, and what does that have to do with the overall staying power of, creative placemaking?
Yeah, I feel like maybe we could find some like answers in those yearbook National Endowment for the Arts in the early years, because a lot of things like interesting when I was doing the project is actually the qualitative part of matching the network analysis and what happened in the history. So in the very, very early years of National Endowment for the Arts, we probably thought that the establishment of NEA is part of the Great Society policy in general, but a lot of it was the kind of urban riots that are happening around that period of time, that artists really feel like we need public support to support the life, the professional life and personal life of artists. And a lot of developers and also the funders of a lot of foundations, they were kind of converged into this big force at the very beginning to push the program formulation of NEA at the very beginning. So I was wondering, even NEA is kind of seems to calling the shot here for the creative placemaking, but you can see Kresge Foundation, some of the other foundations, they're leading a separate conversation even after the Art Place America was sunset. So yeah, I think that's a really great perspective to keep tracking this.
Yeah, and then it makes you think about, well, who needs to continue to stay involved in order for this not to go away?
Yes.
Right. And as in building strategy, you sort of have to figure out who those key actors are. Any other questions that anybody wants to unmute themselves for, put in the chat? I have a lot, but I don't want to take over. So please feel free to unmute yourself. I don't want to be ignoring anyone. Okay. All right.
I'd love to know how the NEA is thinking of maybe using these findings, or what feedback you've gotten so far. It's really great. This is such a useful, application here, and feedback you've gotten from them. I think they might be in attendance as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think a lot of what I'm saying here is really guessing based on empirical data. I don't know if how I'm so interested in knowing how this policy was actually formulated within the agency and what preparation work they did before. I just hope probably this helped them to really map out their alliances at the national level, and thinking about like what Joanna was actually saying before, that how they continue this relationship, and not only for creative placemaking policy, but for other policies, how do they do a better issue framing to make those policies kind of more kind of explicit and significant in general.
I agree. I mean, that was related to my question. I know that we do have an NEA person here, but I don't know if they can speak to sort of the agency's perspective. That being said, I guess I was thinking when I was hearing your presentation was the assumption you make is creative placemaking policies was largely in response to the culture wars and what that ultimately did to the institution, and trying to gain more legitimacy and in the policy sector and resources for sure. But I wonder if the NEA, and particularly the Rocco Landesman and Joan Chikakawa, who were at the forefront of the creative placemaking efforts, like would they agree that that was their motivation? I don't know. I was actually at the NEA in 2011, but I wasn't in senior leadership, so I'm not quite sure. So I don't want to remark either, but I guess I wondered if that assumption was also their initial motivation.
Yeah, the only that I chose it because it was the first large scale sort of policy project since their budget came back to the 90s level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair assumption. I see Sunil has just unmuted himself.
Sorry. So I'm the director. Hi, everyone. I'm Sunil Agar, director of research at the NEA, and I'm not speaking on behalf of our design and creative placemaking team, which is fabulous, or our or others at the NEA. But I just want to say this is a really great analysis for us to look at and think about and reflect upon, how this might affect relationships with these other actors. And I really liked what you were saying, Joanna, about thinking about the sustainability of a de facto cultural policy, or how one tracks that. And I know that's particularly difficult, as you're saying, with social network analysis, to know when certain areas mature or stabilize, or when certain relationships change paths. And that's something we would like to know the long term. What my purpose for hopping on camera for a moment is to say, we actually are going to be releasing what's called a blanket purchase agreement, which sounds very wonky, and it is. It's a government term, but it's essentially a kind of we're putting out an RFP for a raft of different research and evaluation services, and I would strongly hope that social network analysis finds its way in there. That will be open to vendors to compete for, and for experts to team with vendors to compete for this. So what's different about a blanket purchase agreement is this allows us to, the research office at the NEA, to essentially give task orders on a much more rapid basis to contractors to do research studies for us and to do analyses for us, rather than having to wait in the queue with an RFP that takes months and months to compete. And I say that only because if you're at all interested in that, I'll probably be sharing that out through networks. And I certainly hope analyses of these type come our way, because our ability to do such research is limited by not only staff capacity, but our access to these great experts who can perform these kinds of more sophisticated techniques. So I would love to, so I'm not speaking retroactively about what the NEA has done, but I'm very interested in using these kinds of methodologies in the future to inform our work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunil. Yes, one of the reasons and one of the distinctions I've always thought that between US cultural policy and cultural policy in other areas of the world is that there's much more academic research actually commenting on cultural policy in other areas of the world, whereas we don't have that as much in the United States. So seeing papers like yours, where we're actually, critiquing in a constructive way policy that is cultural policy in the US is, I think, extremely helpful. So anyway, that's nice to hear, Sunil, because it sounds like that's in the direction that I've always thought that our field could go. So Greg had a question, and for just your future work, would future work you do continue to focus on creative placemaking, or would you apply some of your network methodology to other areas of the arts sector to explore relationships?
I do wanted to, I think a lot of times it depends on data and workload. A lot of times, if we have more advanced programming techniques, we could be able to do that on an online basis. But as we talked about, a lot of these online networks can only show issue framing and communication network, not necessarily resource-based or more kind of significant relationship that we can discover. So I would definitely apply this to other areas of work. So for instance, another part of my research is community engagement. I think applying social network analysis to understand the relationship between arts organizations and other community partners is really critical for nonprofit arts organizations to map out their resource ecosystem. This is definitely something I wanted to keep doing. And also to answer a question, I also did another policy network analysis, but it's more quantitative kind of statistical modeling. I was actually using advocacy coalition framework and collective action problems to understand how the policy network of creative placemaking are formulated at the local level. So this is another paper that I would like to direct people who are interested in this work to look further.
That's wonderful. Right. Any last questions for Wen before we sign off? Wen, can you just briefly, just because I'm not familiar with the social networking software, what kind of software do you use for social network analysis?
I'm using R.
Oh, you use R. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And then also for the crawling to actually find the hyperlinks, what do you use there?
It's called Issue Crawler.
Okay.
But I have a little bit acknowledgement about that one. When I was using it, it was about 2018. So I know there might be some issues with that software, like in recent 2 years. I've been in communicating with them to fix some of the issues, but it doesn't seem like they know what's going on. So I'm not completely sure the accuracy of that software at this point, but it's still a good resource to go for.
Yeah. Okay. That's very helpful to know. Thank you. All right. Any last questions? Great. Well, with that, thank you, Wen, so much for this wonderful presentation and wonderful discussion as well that resulted. So
thank you so much for having me here. Have things inspiring conversations about the paper. I mean, really helped me to think about the next steps.
Really a pleasure having you and having you involved at the CCA more generally. So I'm happy that we're in the same community now and we got to know each other through this and all of our other friends here. So thank you everybody for attending. And our next workshop is in 2 weeks where we'll have Laurence Dubuc from Mass Culture from Quebec, from Montreal. So we have a Canadian joining us. Always happy to welcome Canadians to our CCA community. All right. Have a great day and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.